Wine Company of Little Rock, who for the third time is sponsoring the live streaming of this program. You might be interested to know that this program is being live streamed to Northeastern State University in Broken Arrow, Carl Albert State College, Sallisaw, the Rogers Public Library, and Crawford County Library. So we are so pleased that these could join us remotely. We are going to begin the evening by showing you a short video that was prepared by our curator, David Kennedy, who is traveling and could not be with us this evening. We hope that this video will provide you with a frame of reference for the program to follow. And after this video, I will introduce the program for the evening. So if we're ready to proceed with the video, let's go.
The tragedy of Goingsnake was many things. It was a fight between factions within the Cherokee Nation. It was a feud between Proctor and Beck families. It was a conflict of federal and tribal jurisdictions. It was also the biggest, bloodiest gunfight in the history of the American West and the deadliest day in the history of the United States Marshals. April 15, 1872, at a small schoolhouse in Goingsnake district of the Cherokee Nation. The events of the late morning are still uncertain and contested. The only agreed-upon facts are that the murder trial of Ezekiel Proctor was moved that morning from the courthouse at Christie to the Whitmire School. 2 deputy United States Marshals and their posse arrived at the location, and shooting began. By the next day, 8 members of the posse, including Deputy U.S. Marshal Jacob Owens, were dead, and several others were wounded. 3 Cherokee were known to have been killed, the defense attorney among them. At least 6 further combatants, including the defendant and the judge, were wounded. This shootout, still the largest event of its kind in the history of the American West, was the result of both a half-century of history and a shooting 2 months prior to the bloodbath which occurred. Many events led to what happened in the Goingsnake district of the Cherokee Nation. The expansion of the United States federal authority, establishment of Fort Smith as a military post and later as a location of a U.S. District Court, and the passing of the Removal Act established an often confrontational relationship between federal and tribal authorities. Within the Cherokee tribe, factions supporting and opposing relocation to Indian Territory engaged in violence against each other during the 1830s and 40s and supported opposing sides of the American Civil War. The tensions were still present in the 1870s. On a family level, the Proctors and the Becks, though related in many ways, were moving in different directions. The Proctors supported Cherokee self-determination and tradition, while the Becks were more open to a changing Cherokee nation. The events of February 13, 1872 seemed minor at the time. Ezekiel Proctor, a deputy sheriff in Goingsnake district, visited the Hildebrand Mill on Flint Creek. Although the reasons given vary by source, we know that Zeke attempted to shoot James Kesterson and instead shot and killed Polly Beck. Zeke turned himself in to the Goingsnake district sheriff. The Cherokee tribe then began criminal proceedings for the murder of Polly Beck. Expecting it would be nothing more than a show trial, the Beck family used all possible legal means to prevent an expected verdict of not guilty. On April 11th, Kesterson appeared before the U.S. Commissioner in Fort Smith in order to swear out a warrant against Zeke for assault with intent to kill. Deputy U.S. Marshal Owens and Peavy were given the directive to arrest Proctor for this charge and left Fort Smith on the 14th. Taking a sizable posse numbering at least 13, the posse started out on the Fayetteville Road and took the branch to Evansville, Arkansas, staying overnight there. The next day they continued on to Dutchtown before crossing into Indian Territory. Following the Barren Fork of the Illinois River, the posse arrived at the Whitmire plantation about 11 in the morning. The posse left for the school shortly thereafter, traveling a distance of less than a mile. With a resulting tally of more than 21 dead and wounded between the two sides, it is not surprising that the term massacre has been applied to the event which followed. The immediate result of the fight was the dispatch of a large posse led by Deputy U.S. Marshal Robinson with a warrant for Proctor and many of the participants of the events at the schoolhouse. Most of the members of the court party had gone into hiding after acquitting Proctor. The Cherokee tribe responded by filing warrants for the surviving members of the initial Marshals posse.
After a congressional investigation and discussions with the Cherokee leadership, President Grant directed the Department of Justice to drop the entire matter. To this day, the question remains, why did the events at Goingsnake happen? By the Treaty of New Echota and the Treaty of 1866, the Cherokee Nation had the jurisdiction to try their own citizens for crimes against other Cherokee. Also, U.S. citizens who married Cherokee were understood to be adopted as Cherokee citizens with full rights. Yet the U.S. District Court in Fort Smith, while acknowledging that Polly Beck was an Indian and was Kestersen's wife, never acknowledged that this inferred adoption of Kestersen as a Cherokee citizen, and seemed to ignore both the legal status accorded to him and the sovereignty of the Cherokee Nation. There are still questions about what happened at the mill and the schoolhouse. Additional questions remain to be asked about the reasoning behind the court's pursuit of Proctor. These are issues which have not seen resolution, but hopefully through time and discussion we can find answers.
One person that I would like to recognize who is not here tonight is Leslie Higgins, our Director of Education. Many of you have come to know Leslie, and in recent days she has given birth to a baby boy, and so she could not join us tonight. Rick Parker is our speaker tonight. Rick is a sixth-generation Arkansan and has been in both fine and decorative art conservation for 40 years. Mr. Parker attended John Brown University and did his graduate work at the Smithsonian Institution's Furniture Conservation Training Program. He has lectured at Smithsonian, MIT, and Colonial Williamsburg, as well as others. He has worked on objects from the White House, Mount Vernon, Monticello, and many other locations important to national, tribal, and presidential history. A published author, Rick has also lectured at numerous colleges and universities and state and regional historical associations. He is a peer-reviewed professional associate of the American Institute for Conservation and was the first conservator in private practice to be named as national president of their Wooden Artifacts Group. In 2011, Parker Conservation completed the 25-year hand replication of the 3,000-plus-year-old Gordian table from ancient Turkey, using wood 40 to 60,000 years old for the project. Regionally, he has lectured on American Civil War history, focusing on the Trans-Mississippi guerrilla warfare, and expects to publish a book on the subject in 2018. As a consultant for the United States Marshals Museum, Parker has greatly influenced the planned content for the tragedy at Goingsnake exhibit area. Additionally, Parker is a master scuba diver and certified as a rescue diver. After I went to work for the United States Marshals Museum in 2009, I quickly learned about the Goingsnake Massacre. And each time I would hear someone speak about the Goingsnake Massacre, I would also hear the name Rick Parker in conjunction therewith. So I went up and met Rick and learned that he knows about as much about this tragedy as any person anywhere. Rick has dedicated the same amount of passion for researching the tragedy at Goingsnake and the Deputy U.S. Marshals involved in that as he has in restoring ancient furniture. Rick told me before the program tonight that he had restored a staircase using only Q-tips. Now think about that for a minute. He has used the same meticulous research in preparing the program tonight, and we are privileged and honored to have Rick Parker give this program. So Rick, please come forward.
I will remember. Wow. I apologize. I was going to wear my Q-tip sponsored T-shirt for this tonight. I greatly appreciate getting the opportunity to come down the mountain and speak here on this, because this is truly a really serious thing, literally in my entire life, to be involved with. I have been involved with Goingsnake, both sides of the fence families, since I was 4 or 5 years old. I can't remember. First slide, please. I wanted to go in, and Jim has stolen a little bit of my thunder. I wanted to kind of explain a little bit of what I do professionally and why it has rubbed off into this and the effects it will have. I am not an academic. Anybody that knows me will know that real quick. I have no intention of going that route. That said, I do some very serious research into objects. Some of the things I've worked on that really got my attention, I was the first phone call for a discovered Leonardo da Vinci from Buenos Aires. I've worked on Rembrandts. I've worked on about every major artist that you can think of. I've had furniture valued in the millions of dollars that I had to authenticate. To do that kind of work requires a very, very specific, systematic approach to why is it here, what do you want to accomplish, what is hiding here, what are the effects of age, where is it going, is it going to last, is it terminal? A lot of things go into that. And I've taken the Goingsnake issue pretty much along those lines. One of the tenets of conservation is that we do no damage, and that we try to find what the root cause of the problem was in the first place. And with that in mind, that's what I've tried to do. I think enough damage has been done in the last 146 years for the next 146. So I'm looking for what's going on here. One of the first things that I personally look for, and by the way, this is, I'll get to this in a second. This is one of my favorite shots. One of the things that I look for is, what are we going to do with this? And I'm looking for, what are we going to do with Goingsnake? We can take several approaches. We can carry on the way it has been the last 146 years, or we can really delve in. And I've chosen to really delve in. One of the things I really started out doing early on was, what do we all agree on? What do we all disagree on? What is blatant fabrication? What really would we like to see happen from all of this? And with that in mind, you get a lot of different ideas. There are people who don't want this resolved, that don't want to. There are people who have heard wonderful stories from beloved family members for generations that just simply don't bear out. One of my criteria is, I want 3 sources. I want 3 good, solid sources. And it's real interesting. I've been working on this for decades. As a child, just to show you exactly how long, as a child before elementary school, my family was going to Saturday dinners in a small diner in our hometown with some of the Foreman clan. I have worked for decades with some of the walking sticks. I know several of the scrapers quite well. The Becks, worked with my mother, who was the mayor of the city that we lived in. She met with them quite frequently, and as a result, growing older, I've just grown up with these people. I know both sides. I've heard, believe me, there's not a story hardly that you can tell me that those family members haven't pushed hard on, and we've had some real interesting conversations sometimes. But one of the most amazing things has happened since Christmas. I had started this little odyssey, 35 years ago, writing my book on the guerrilla warfare in northwest Arkansas, Indian Territory, and southeast Missouri. And in doing so, I realized real quickly there is no way that you are going to separate the Indian issue from the Civil War here. If you're looking at Gettysburg, Atlanta, Richmond, all of the Grants, Lees, all of that on the Eastern Theater, probably not going to make a lot of sense to you. But for those people living back here, there was a war, and then there was another war. And in some respects, a lot of the hard feelings, and this goes back to the conservation tenets, we haven't corrected the problem, therefore we still have the problem with us. And around Christmas, overtures were made. I have felt like there were materials out there. You can just, when you've done this as long as I have, you can just smell holes that you know it's there. And after Christmas, started meeting with several members of the Cherokee Nation, several people who had nothing to do with the Cherokee Nation but were researchers. Had several people looking in a lot of really out-of-the-way places. And as a result of one meeting, the floodgates opened and material started coming forth. So anything I would have written before Christmas, I really would want to scream, stop the presses, and let's get this new material added, because it really did open a lot of what we've been thinking about for 146 years open. It answers a lot of questions. By the same token, it also asks more questions. There's more material out there, and it's coming, and it'll come. With the opening of the museum, things will be found. People will start looking. Right now, I don't think a lot of people are looking, but that'll change, and new material will come up, and I will be so disappointed if all of us don't have to rewrite everything we've thought 5 or 10 years from now because of the new material that's added. Like I said earlier, you can't really start with just the Goingsnake. You have to look at what led us to this point. And even with the American Civil War, a lot of what led us to this point occurred in Europe. We are a nation of transplants. We are immigrants, all of us, with the exclusion of some Native Americans. All of us have come from elsewhere. Just for my information, and we'll get back with this one so I can see, how many of you had ancestors that you know of that were here in 1850? Okay, not a lot of hands. We'll get back to that point. Most of our relatives left Europe for religious reasons, economic reasons. Quite frankly, a lot of us left to get out of jail. My family was thrown out of France because they were Protestants in a Catholic nation. We all ended up here in the United States. Before the Revolution, we had issues with the Native Americans. We had issues with the French. We had issues with the Spanish. And in all of those cases, there's a common denominator that goes along with all of this. These are people that we're elbowing out of the way a bit. And for people who have lived for generations upon generations upon generations, that's not easily handled. We were either by default creating an empire or by plan. And there's documentation to support pretty much both of those thoughts. But either way, little by little, we systematically have wiped out culture after culture after culture. We've demonized our enemies. They were fire-breathing monsters. They were murderers. They were mother rapers, everything in the book, anything to demean them. This went on through the Revolution. And if you read about it, you'll find that various Indian tribes supported one side, another group supported another side, yet a third group supported the French in Quebec. But everybody was evil. And if you stop to think about it, it has to be that way. If these are really great people and you love them to death, that really makes it very difficult to go out and kill them, to kill their children, to wipe them off the face of the earth, to burn their cities, to burn their villages. Can't be done. So we had kind of trained ourselves to demonize these people. The American Revolution came along, and we created something that very few people in the world had ever seen before, something that everybody wanted to buy into and be part of. We had and we have something very special. The problem is, very quickly after that, can we hit the next slide, please? Very quickly after that, we started acquiring property. We bought from Napoleon because, quite frankly, Napoleon had a little issue with the British and was broke. This is one real interesting little Kurz and Allison print that is in our family collection that I absolutely love. We've been to this site, and one of the real strong reasons that Jackson won this battle was the support of Native Americans, who consequently, within 10 years, many of them were killed by American soldiers burning their villages, mistaking them for the enemy because they all look alike. And that's a quote. That is pathetic. But this is what we were going through. These people that I'm going to talk about tonight lived in a different time. They had different morals. They had different ethics. We would have great difficulty probably sitting in the same room and having conversation with them. There would be some issues. These were tough guys and women. Everybody involved really was scratching just to survive. And their whole outlook on life, from where they came from a Europe. I don't know how many of you have been to Europe willingly, what European royalty got them to do, because I wouldn't be a good follower. But these people saw an opportunity. They came to America for a better life. And for most of them, it was hard, but they got that better life. After the Battle of New Orleans, the Texas issue came along. We had some instability, the War of 1812. We were becoming an international player, not a power, just simply our name was on the book. But with the Texas issue, a Cherokee adopted son of all things, Sam Houston, otherwise known to the Cherokee as the Raven, did a remarkable thing defeating Santa Anna at and I will use my family's word for it, San Jacinto. I know that's not the right pronunciation, but that's what my family called it. And with that came a huge, huge acquisition of property, a huge acquisition of property. And one of the things that was always in the making was that Texas was going to be another state, period. We were migrating into Texas. And I often wonder how that would have worked if the cards were flipped on that. That would probably have been interesting. But those were the times. And those are the things that we really have to weigh in when we're talking about all this issue. But again, here's a Cherokee doing an amazing thing. And Sam Houston's one of my favorite historical characters. Let's go to the next slide. I don't know whether you can read this or not. This is from 1843, and this is from the General Assembly here in Arkansas. And the first couple of sentences pretty much say it all. A savage war upon the frontier by hordes of reckless and savage Indians. This gets back to that demonization thing. If there were any savages, it was probably the white people preying on the Indians coming on the relocation. Some of that is just atrocious. There are books that you read, and then there are the stories that tell the real stories. And that's what's really hard in this day and age, is to separate what really happened 50, 60 years ago from today, because we've lost a lot in the transition. This is an amazing, amazing document. Daniel Boone's nephew surveyed the old military road, which runs from Minnesota down to the Red River, that runs literally along Highway 59 in North Arkansas. Little known fact. But they all kept having this impact on us. This resolution just screamed, what the heck? They were so afraid of the Indian relocation that had come. And most of these people, a lot of them had advanced degrees. These were not ignorant people. If you read their legislative works, their legal documents, these are finely honed, well-crafted individuals that know their business. They are not living out in teepees and huts, but we had to demonize these people. Otherwise, there were some problems. The land that we took for the relocation is probably one of the biggest land grabs the world has ever seen. We literally stole some of the most valuable property in the United States. I don't know what it's worth, southeast area of the United States. Now, I don't know what it's worth in the billions of dollars, but it would be tremendous. And you've got to believe that if you had family, had lived there for generations, you should see some of the Cherokee homes. Remarkable structures, remarkable farms, well maintained, operated, incredible places. To just be kind of herded out. And I think a lot of the material that you see, where these people are being herded by, soldiers with bayonets and guns, some of that is very accurate, some of it's not. But either way, they lost their land, and we took it. And that's going to be a hard thing to swallow. After that, there was not a treaty that I'm aware of that the United States has not violated. We have jerked those people around every which way but up. So many tribes that were available to the United States during the Revolutionary days just ceased to exist. One of the concerns I have with the relocation, I have worked with a lot of material relating to John Ross. I don't think Ross really understood Andrew Jackson. I think Jackson was a force to be dealt with, and I don't think until the last moment that Ross realized just what a force he really was to be dealt with. And as a result, the Trail of Tears occurs. So many people died along that way, and those that didn't die came to Oklahoma and found life very different than what it had been promised them. It was hard. It was very hard. The requisitioned provisions didn't get here on time. The housing didn't get here. The medical didn't get here. The protection didn't get here. They were on their own. These are things that do not lend themselves well to creating goodwill between people. When you look back at what the United States has done to the Spanish, the French, the British, the Mexicans, the Russians, all of the native tribes, there's a problem there. And as a conservator, that tells me that's a problem that we need to address and fix. We're doing it a little bit. I mean, I've seen more in the last several years than what we've probably seen in the last 50. By far not fixed yet, though. Next slide, please. Along this time, we had the little tiff with Mexico. This is post-relocation. Kind of got us sidetracked a bit because it looked like Mexico wanted their land back from Texas. There were real serious problems on both sides. The lines weren't really well defined. For the Mexicans, it was the Nueces River. For the Americans, it was the Rio Grande. And Mr. Polk committed one of the great poker plays I've ever heard of, authorized the United States Army to go ahead and attack the Mexican forces. Fortunately for him, 2 days before that was received, the Mexicans crossed the Nueces, which allowed the Texans to think that, well, that has been violated, and they went ahead and attacked. So war was started had they not crossed, that would have been a real interesting development, how we aggressively became the aggressor and started that one. The first test after that for our area, and again, you have to remember, I'm real partial to this part of the world. As a Civil War historian, I really don't care what happened on the East Coast. My sentiments are here. What were we going through here? Because what we were going through here was so vastly different than what everyone else did. Wasn't even funny. The time of trouble for the Cherokee Nation right after relocation in the from 1839 into the 40s, this was not a real pleasant place to be. And rightfully so. The treaty party had signed a treaty with very, very few Cherokees supporting that treaty. By Cherokee law, those that traded, sold, gave away, whatever, lost in poker games, tribal lands were subject to the death penalty. And when the Ridges were assassinated, that was according to Cherokee law. Brutal? Oh, yeah. I think it was geared to make a point, and it certainly did. But these were really, really ugly times, and it's not the place tonight to go into all of that. But it's leading to the character. What were the Cherokee thinking? How were they responding to what we as Americans in a developing country were doing? It had to be confusing to them. The Kansas-Missouri affair probably started things a little early. And one of the real conflicting problems with that was, for a long time we have been demonizing all of these other people. These are the enemy. These are the people that are trying to kill us. With Missouri, Kansas, all of a sudden that changed because it was us. This was an American thing. I wish I had a little poll here on the blood pressure rates. If you look at the abolitionist issue before Bloody Kansas, you can directly link that with the abortion issue today. See, blood pressure went up here, didn't it? It went up. That's exactly what I want it to do. I want you to feel the uneasiness, the questioning of, what the heck? Because that's exactly what our ancestors were feeling. And with that, we had to make a decision. Golly, these people are my relatives. These people are my neighbors. These people are my friends. And yet we went out and killed them. And that's a really tough thing. If you read about Bloody Kansas, it was just that. But that was only the very beginning. That was just the tip of the iceberg. If I can have the next slide. And this is just something to ponder. The next thing that came along was, and I call it the Uncivil War. I have real problems calling it the Civil War. If anything, I'll call it the Late War. It was the Uncivil War. For the first time, everything about this country was questioned. The America that existed prior to the American Uncivil War, the Late War, was an entirely different place than where we live today. And anybody that thinks otherwise really needs to go back and do a little more research. Different world. For the first time, religion, if you're a Protestant or a Catholic, if you're North or you're South, if you're a slaveholder, if you're not, everything was in play. Emotions were right on the surface. And I think we all know where the Uncivil War actually ended up. By the time it was over, Indian Territory, Northeast Oklahoma, Northwest Arkansas, not so much down here, but more to the northwest where we live, had the highest incidence of widows and orphans of anywhere in the United States. Everything was broken down. Everything was eradicated. Every bit of social order that would establish any kind of civility was long gone. And these people were living that. It's kind of interesting to follow Albert Pike's journey, starting actually about this time of year. I think it was May 20th, 1861. He left from here in Fort Smith, right? Probably pretty close to where we're sitting tonight, and made a pilgrimage through all of Indian Territory, meeting with every tribe known to man. What he wanted to do was to get them. There was no way the South could win the war if they were fighting the Native Americans. Could not happen. Couldn't fight on two fronts. They were able to take the treaties that the Native Americans had developed over the years with the United States, sweeten it up a little bit, and he actually got everybody to sign on board. One of the last sign-outs occurred, I believe, and somebody here will know this better than I will, but I believe it was August 20th or 21st. The Cherokee were holdouts because they really didn't like where this was going, didn't feel it was in their best interest, but they knew that if they didn't sign on, they were going to be a little island in the middle of some real ugly times, and they had been living in some real ugly times. So they signed on. After the Battle of Pea Ridge in March of 1862, there was a huge defection of Cherokee under John Drew and several others that just left the Confederacy. And some of the documentation I've got on near Tahlequah, the Rose Hill where John Ross lived, several people saw this really large contingent of Confederate soldiers riding toward them and just knew that it was not going to be good, and they were all defectors. And this really changed the balance here. To the end of the war, what the North and South was doing in the East really didn't have that much merit. The guerrilla campaign here in the West is a phenomenal story, an amazing story. Bruce Catton wrote a trilogy in 1860 during the Centennial. Our history here covers, and I should know this, something like 8 or 10 pages. Anything west of the Mississippi, it's almost non-existent. Shelby Foote came along after the television series, the Civil War, Ken Burns program. Shelby's book did us even more of a favor. He was down to 2 pages. People don't care what happened here. What happened here has affected, literally, in some cases, our entire national fabric. This is kind of, and I think, I honestly don't know what this is doing here. There should be slide number 5, order number 15, 1862. Now, let's just go back to the mill. Anyway, I printed up just so you guys could kind of read it. It was the orders that we lived under here, that the Cherokee lived under here, that the people that lived here that would ultimately produce the Goingsnake issue lived here with. It was absolutely brutal. Those of you with kids, imagine having your house burned, all of your belongings taken, if your children were wounded, even remotely fighting for one side or the other. Both sides literally cut everybody off here. You were either on board one side or you were on board the other side. And if you were on the other side and got caught, it was ugly. This kept reinforcing all of this. So by 1872, the war's been over 7 years. With the incidents of widows and orphans here, you can imagine what the economy was like. Homes burned. Who's going to provide the next meal? You're not going to run down to the next super center and pick up something for the evening meal. Where's all this coming from? There was such a dependency. These people had been through things that I don't even want to think about how hard it was. So February 13th, and I'm going to deviate a little bit here and there. One of the things I really wanted to do, and this was kind of why I felt so strong about doing the program tonight, every time I've talked about Goingsnake, it's been about the Whitmire School, the shooting. There are other factors in play, and we're going to talk about some of those tonight. Make sure I'm on time here. It's really looking back on all of this and getting an understanding of how upset these people were. Next slide, please. This is the mill, by the way. This is the waterway, and this is probably the closest picture we have to what the mill would have looked like. The original mill that was involved in the shooting was washed away by a flood, and this was a 1903 building that was later restructured over on the same foundations. February 13th is a domestic disturbance. I'm convinced there is no way we're ever going to know exactly what was in Zeke Proctor's, Jim Kesterson, or Polly Beck's minds that day. Pretty clearly it wasn't a drunk Indian. I think that is just demeaning as everything. There's no way. Were there hurt feelings? Were there animosities? Proctor had been married, or Kesterson had been married to Proctor's sister, left them destitute. That had to be a major issue, and he had to be irritated with Kesterson. On July don't have that date with me. Anyway, sometime early 1871, winter of 1871, the Goingsnake District Court judge allowed Mary Beck to hire a white man, James Kesterson, with the family's approval to help her run the mill. Okay, could we have the next slide, please? Now, make no bones about it. This probably is not Polly Beck. We don't know of a picture that can be absolutely confirmed. What has come up since Christmas, though, is the fact that there is a problem with this photograph. It may be Polly Beck. We don't know. 3 different family members have 3 different versions of this. Like everything else Goingsnake related, it's kind of a problem. But this may be her. She was a very attractive woman. She had a number of husbands. Men died like flies during this period. It's not that she was that flirtatious or, just out on the fly. Men died, and quite frankly, she needed help. The family needed help at the mill, so it's not that uncommon for a guy like Kesterson. Curious about the timing, though. The writing is illegible, and if you think about it, March, M-A-R, or May, M-A-Y, well, the R and the Y are, you can't tell what it is. But on the document on May 18th, 1871, Judge Wiley Glover Thornton, Goingsnake District Judge, married Polly Beck Hildebrand and Jim Kesterson. End of subject. And with that, there's a reference that he was now subject to the laws of the Cherokee Nation. That is kind of a powerful statement. He should have been by being married to Zeke Proctor's sister, but given how things work, it was very common for the wife to throw the husband out and retain all of the property. That may have happened. It may not have happened. We don't know. We just don't know. I'm hoping some documents surface that'll kind of clarify that. Either way, after the Civil War in 1866, the treaty was reestablished with the United States with a lot of concessions given by the Cherokee Nation. That treaty is what we go by. And it boils down to, if you were a white person caught in the Cherokee Nation violating a law, you were subject to the laws of the United States and brought back to Fort Smith. If you were a white person adopted into the Cherokee Nation, one way or the other, primarily by marriage, then you were subject to the Cherokee laws. And this is one of the root causes of the questioning about, was there jurisdictional reason for the posse, the Marshal Service, to be at Goingsnake. And you read enough of this material, you come to the conclusion that no, there probably wasn't. And I realize that's a lot to swallow, because that is a massive point, but the material is just not there. And I don't think it will surface, because the more material that has been researched and we have gone through this, everything is leading more and more along those lines. That said, were the Marshals going into Indian Territory with malice? No. Those guys were the salt of the earth. You could not ask for people that responded better. Just to give you an idea, Marshal Owens, and I'll read this is a quote. A year before, in April of 1871, one Wyatt Earp was accused of horse theft in Indian Territory. The April 1st, 1871 Bill of Information, U.S. versus Wyatt Earp, Ed Kennedy, John Shorn, all white men and not Indians or members of any tribe of Indians by birth or marriage or adoption, on the 28th day of March, 1871, the Indian Territory, said district did feloniously, willfully steal, take away, carry away 2 horses, each of value of $100, the property, goods, and chattels of one William Keyes, and pray a writ signed J.G. Owens. That's kind of treading on Americana, if there ever was one, accusing Wyatt Earp of horse theft. That's huge. But that's the kind of marshals we had. Apparently, he did it because he broke out of jail. There was a warrant for his arrest. To make a long story short, he wasn't ever brought to trial. One of his compadres was found innocent. But there were also threats made about don't testify, which would not have been the first time. That says a lot about J.G. Owens, who was, as if you all don't know this, was the marshal in charge of the party going to Goingsnake. Marshal Peavy, interestingly enough, was just along for the ride. He was not part of the original posse. He was asked by either Donnelly or Churchill here in Fort Smith to accompany, but he was going to Kansas on martial business. He didn't have a warrant for Proctor's arrest. He was just along as another body, and they felt like they needed it. Next slide. This is going to be a curious guy, and I'm going to ask you to come back to this in your memory. This is Old Man Beck, quote unquote. This is a brother to Polly. Doesn't look very old, because people didn't live to be very old in this climate. This is his wartime photograph. He was a Confederate soldier. But he was the individual, along with Joe Peavy, that was able to drag Marshal Owens, mortally wounded, away from the school site. It's interesting to note, and this is, I'm going to kind of put the horse before the cart here, but in a letter dated April 16th, the day after the shooting at Whitmire, in a letter to Chief Downing from the Goingsnake Sheriff, quote, "Previously, that is, at the second calling of the court in this case, I had been applied to by a person professing to be a United States Deputy Marshal to relinquish possession of said prisoner to him in pursuant with a writ said by him to have been obtained outside this nation." This is huge. When you put it in context by itself, not that big a deal. You put it in context with several other documents, and this starts explaining why all of this evolved as the shooting at Whitmire did evolve. For some reason, the Cherokee were spooked. Next slide. This has nothing to do with anything we're talking about. This is just a picture of Westville, Oklahoma, 2 decades after the shooting, but I wanted you to kind of get a feel for what things look like in the area. Just a nice little town out in the middle of nowhere, not a lot of industry, but growing. Okay, next slide. This, on the other hand, gets more interesting. This is the Saline Courthouse. And somebody correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think this is the only standing Cherokee courthouse from the period. The Goingsnake Courthouse, where a trial was going on, would have been almost identical to this structure. And if you can imagine trying to make this a defensive position, boy, you've got your hands full with that one. So many doors, so many windows, so many ways of approaching it. The fact that somebody came to this court, we know for a fact that court had gone on 4 days, but that doesn't mean it was simultaneously 4 days. The documents were done April the 4th that set the trial judge of Judge Sixkiller as being the judge of record for the trial. There were 2 other people. One was related or had relations to one side or the other. A second person didn't have relations but was really troubled about how the process was going. One of the tenets is there are 24 people that are selected, 12 by the defendant, and then the defendant picks the jury. That sounds like a loaded jury. He resigned. So Judge Sixkiller was the judge of record for this. And this would have been where all of this would have happened. This is still standing just off 412 on Rose Prairie. It's an incredible, incredible place to see if you haven't seen it. If you're interested in this kind of thing, it's worth the trip up there to see. And also, interestingly enough, on April 29th is the first acknowledgement of Kesterson as an adopted member of the Cherokee Nation by local authorities. Curious, and it was mentioned and alluded to, that's the one thing that still, I think, eludes all of us. How did Kesterson pull this off about not being an adopted member of the tribe at that time. That is a real curious, especially considering that the massacre at Whitmire hadn't happened yet. There are some real questions that records from Donnelly and Churchill's office would be real interesting to go through. And having been through and tried to research some of these records in the 60s and 70s, a lot of records were hauled out of the courthouse to be burned and just destroyed for lack of space. There's no telling what was in those records. Some of them might have survived, good possibility. Some of them have, some of them might not. We just don't know. The shooting itself, I think at this point we're all looking for he was right, he was wrong, and that isn't going to happen. One of the things we've talked about developing some of the museum exhibits is there are so many different angles to this. After reading and researching the new material since December, I would strongly, strongly have to disagree. I think there's one story here. And a lot of what has been conjecture up to this point is pretty well confirmed. Neither side was right. Neither side was wrong. If someone had done to me what the United States had done to the Cherokee, I would probably do things a lot worse than what a lot of the Cherokee did. By the same token, and this is again a little post-fact, after, and let me get into what happened. Maybe you all are aware of this or not. This went on almost a year and a half. U.S. Grant and the Department of Justice finally threw up their hands and said, we can't prosecute. That is a sad, sad statement on our judicial system at the time. But the facts were, everybody for the Marshal Service was dead. There were a host of people with all kinds of designs on how this was going to play out, and quite frankly, they didn't trust us. And I don't blame them. I wouldn't have trusted somebody that had done to me what was done to them either. Not at all. So there was reason on both sides for strong concern. But by November of 1873, it was all over as far as Washington was concerned. What wasn't over and is hiding out there, it's hiding here in Fort Smith. I'd bet money on it. Marshal Logan Roots did a survey. I mean, in 1873, we were bored to tears with surveys. Every time you buy a roll of toilet paper, you have to have a survey. It's crazy. But Roots did a survey. He asked the same, and I don't know how many because we've never seen a full list of all of the questions. 10, 12 questions were given to every marshal and deputy marshal, asking the same thing of each one of them. Their responses are phenomenal. And these guys bared their souls. They knew full well that the United States Department of Justice had put them out as bait, and we all know what happens to bait. Their responses, how they treated prisoners, how they were treated trying to process legal documents going into Indian Territory is 2 or 3 talks at one time. It's absolutely phenomenal. And I don't know if I've talked to maybe 1 or 2 people that had read part of it but hadn't gotten a lot of this material together. It is absolutely a phenomenal testament to the tenacity, the bravery, for lack of a better word, just the bigness of these guys that were working this district. They were incredible men. They were absolutely the best, and this is so overused, I hate to even use it. They were the best of the best. And a lot of them got in places by hook and crook. J.B. Owens, for example, was a Confederate veteran. He could not take the oath of office. Marshal Logan Roots, when swearing Owens in, scratched out that portion about bearing arms against the United States and signed him up. Turned out he was one of the better officers that has served this area. There was a confidence in these guys. They understood each other. They understood what the job was, that it was thankless. There was no way to win. They were not going to win. and they were not getting support from Washington. To read the politicians' thoughts on the problems in Indian Territory is almost laughable. That said, next slide, please. This is the Lewis Six Killer document where he was appointed the judge of record for the trial. Next document. This is the infamous Christie Schoolhouse, not the Proctor, or not the Whitmire Schoolhouse. The only difference being, instead of 2 windows on the left, there would have been 1 window. When the trial was going on, it only, and this is one thing that research is showing is opening up a lot of new information. The court was moved officially on the morning of the 15th, around noon. The school was dismissed. The school instructor was told, get the kids out of here. Court's coming in here. This goes back to that deputy who in no uncertain terms wanted Proctor, wasn't given Proctor, and threatened them with the verbiage is pretty straightforward. If you read it, you'd understand exactly what it meant. This is what triggered the extra guards, the extra weapons. There was no way that that courthouse with all of the glass doors and windows and upper story could be defended. Not possible. This, on the other hand, by both sides of the fence, chinking was knocked out of the logs for shooting portals. It was to ambush the Marshals. To this point, the Cherokee Nation had the high ground. When they thought they could ambush the United States Marshals Service and kill all of them, probably not the best line of thought. It was not pretty. And again, it goes back to that trust issue. I wouldn't have trusted the Marshals coming. And those Marshals, I guarantee you, didn't trust the people inside. The first shot came within the school out. And I know that one's a hard one to take. We have followed the bullet paths. You have to put a lot of documents together. There's a lot of research. We have followed the bullet paths. One of the Becks, White Sut Beck, got to the door first with Marshal Owens, who was a little behind. And as he opened the door, set foot on the threshold, nobody is sure what, I won't say everyone, but too many of both sides agree that weapons were not drawn, the pistols were in the holsters, the guns were carried off of the hip with the barrel pointing up. When he got to the door and opened the door, there were guns pointing at him. The natural response to that is, oh. He immediately turned to the left, and a pistol ball entered his left shoulder and lodged in his collarbone. You know it was a pistol because if it was one of the rifles used, it would have blown his head off. He fell down, not mortally wounded, but very severely wounded. Johnson Proctor was one of the first at the door. If he was lying on the threshold at the door, nobody is for sure. But if that gun was on his hip and pointed up, and Johnson Proctor grabbed it, apparently Sutbeck was able to discharge it, and that's what killed Proctor at the door. One of the things that just does not hold water is that from the door with a shotgun, probably a 10 gauge, maybe an 8, but probably a 10, anybody firing into a full courtroom would have sprayed buckshot, buck and ball, whatever the load was, all over North America inside that building. And those people weren't going to sit there and let somebody walk up. That wasn't the intention. They did have arms, and one of the curious things that really is interesting, if you think about that little structure, the weaponry, black powder, if you ever shot those weapons, the smoke is incredible. You have one window to shoot out of and one door. And in one volley, almost all the Marshals that died were either wounded or killed in that first volley. Riley Woods and Mr. Ward They marched to the school in pairs. And Ward and Woods were the second pair and died almost immediately. Ward was trying to get on his mule, of all things, when he was shot down. But one of the little-known facts that is also confirmed was that Riley Woods had over 100 piercings in his body after he was dead. This was a real frustrating, people were working out some real hostility on this. This was an issue. And it's not that dissimilar to what went on at the Little Bighorn, in 1876. There were a lot of pent-up issues that got discharged that day. And again, I don't know how as many people got wounded on the Indian side as did. It's quite possible with that building full of smoke, the emotion, the adrenaline, it's entirely possible that there was some friendly fire that went on. We don't know. With that kind of emotion going on, you're not going to be able to think clearly. Things are going to happen real slow. If you've ever been in a situation where you've been shot at in an ugly time just goes to nothing. What one person saw up close might be completely different than what somebody saw, 20 feet away. We just don't know. But we do know that that first volley, those marshals were gone. And how Joe Peavy managed to survive without, and they say without a scratch, that's not quite true because a rifle round came very close and he was almost blinded by it across both eyes. I don't know how he did. His pistol was in his holster, but the handle had been blown off of it. His clothing was full of holes. His hat had holes. Somehow or another, he got Marshal Owens to the Whitmire house and got back. Realizing what was going on that evening, and again, I won't go into all the details because we're about out of time, and I've got a book that's going to be published, and I'd really like somebody to be interested and buy the book. But there were really incredible things that happened afterward. The Marshal Peavy and Fanoy, who stayed, and one other marshal that was wounded, took the wounded to Cincinnati, where they were chased all the way, which is about 10 miles or so. And one of the things that I've been trying to research, about the distance a horse and rider can cover in one day, and by backtracking, it's so many miles from point A to point B, from point B to point C. We're actually timing and getting a time frame of when this happened. And the old adage that this occurred in the morning, simply not possible. The better likelihood, and it's mentioned several places, that it was mid-afternoon around 2:30 to 3. This is a story that's by no means finished. Could we have the next couple of slides? Just kind of click through a little bit at a time. This is what the posse would have looked like. This is from 1878, a little later. The other picture was from 1870, about 1869, 1870. This is Marshal Owens. Next slide. And this is the sad part. We can talk about the politically correct venues, the legalities, the jurisdictional issues. This is the reality of what happened. Next slide. I'm going to take a minute here because I think this is important. George Selvage left a wife and 4-year-old son with no support. Next slide. This is Jesse Black Sutbeck, left a wife and son, approximately 1-year-old, with no little support. Sam Beck, his family status is unknown, but he's certainly dead and died on the 15th. Next slide. Whitesett outlived it, and there's some interesting stories about Whitesett. William Hicks' burial site is unknown. Jim Ward's burial location is unknown. Next slide. This is Riley Woods, left a wife and 2 children with no support. He's the only marshal still buried at the Whitmire Cemetery, and one of the things that makes this hallowed ground, as far as I'm concerned, and I hope a lot of others, is the fact that the marshals that got on site first buried him there. He hasn't moved, and to me it would be a shame to move him. You'll notice there are no markers. That needs to be corrected. Of the Cherokee killed, Johnson Proctor is assumed buried in the Proctor family cemetery near Zeke. Mose Alberti, Proctor's attorney, his family status was unknown at the time. And it's not that it's unknown, I just haven't had time to research it. But we believe he's buried in the Alberti Chapel Cemetery in Adair County. Andrew Pallone, family status unknown, and his burial site's unknown. There were 2 other white men that were killed that were found dead near the school, and possibly as many as 11 to 20 wounded Cherokee died within several days as a result of their wounds. No names, this is hard to confirm, and I don't know that we'll ever get anywhere with that one. After a long and colorful life, Ezekiel Proctor died February 28, 1907, and is buried in the Johnson Cemetery, just west of Siloam Springs. The tragedy of all of this is Holly Beck Hildebrand. She's forgotten. She lies in an unmarked grave not far from the mill, maybe 100 yards or so. Her case was never resolved. There was never satisfaction. She's just forgotten. She had a 13-year-old daughter. 2 years after the shooting, in 1874, that daughter was going to school. If you can locate Gentry on a map, there's a little town named Double Springs or Bloomfield. She was going to school at Double Springs. She rode a horse from there back to the mill, which is probably a good 15, 18-mile trip, if you follow the old routes, to get married without her mother and without a lot of her family members. And I'd like to close with a quote by Bruce Catton, which I've always found fairly appropriate for things like this. Americans have always concentrated on the success story. The other side of the coin may be worth looking at. Not the resounding failures or the congenital misfits, but the unsung, average folk whose lives tell a quiet story of ambition gently trailing off into obscurity. America is equally a tale of might-have-beens and used-to-bes, of ghost towns and shuttered mills, abandoned farms and weed-grown rail beds, and 1,000 other evidences of blunted hopes and dreams gone into the national fiber along with the triumph and achievement. As often as not, the bright vision simply went to seed before its ripening. What I would really like to see accomplished from all of this is that finally we have a story. It's one single story. And as hard as some of it is to take, pretty well documented by a lot of sources that it happened that way. Do we have 2 different ideas of what went wrong, what happened? Yes, we do. Those need exploring as well. But there's a core story here that needs to be told. And after 146 years, this needs to be resolved. And that's one of the things that I hope to have something to do with, because I have known so many of these families personally. I feel like I owe them something a little extra. It's more than just a story. It's more than just academic work for me. This is personal, and it needs to be addressed. And I think as the United States of America, we can do a lot better, and we need to do a lot better. But in doing that, we also have to admit sometimes we stumble, and that's okay because we all do it. The Cherokee have stumbled, and I think they have opened up since Christmas in a remarkable way. And I think this is a really good time with this museum opening that maybe we start a whole new chapter of Goingsnake and put some of the tales to rest. And with that, thank you for your attention. I'm so pleased, and only Jim Dunn will appreciate this, that we didn't need the chicken wire in front of the podium tonight. Not yet. Is there a back way out of this place? But thank you. Am I correct? Questions?
Yeah.
I would be open for some questions. I'm sure there's something. Why were the marshals dispatched to the Whitmire School? It was one of those, if you know anything about domestic disputes, this was not pretty by any stretch. The Beck family felt like There was not going to be a credible resolution in a Cherokee court. The sitting judge, Judge Sixkiller, was the lieutenant colonel of the 3rd Penn Home Guard that Zeke Proctor was a member of. They were members of the Katua organization, which one of the principals involved in dealing with the United States government and the Cherokee was one of the people that started the Katua organization. They didn't feel like they could get a fair trial, and they were very concerned, and that's why they went to Fort Smith. Now, flip that coin around. The Proctors and the Cherokee Nation were as equally concerned that if Zeke Proctor got on a horse and headed to Fort Smith, like so many other Indians, he was going to get hung. And I think that's probably accurate. There were reasons on both sides why I don't want this trial to happen. And that's one of the real tragedies. I don't know how you would ever get resolution to this. That the Marshals were there, again, they were there without malice. They had a thankless job to do. And had the shooting not occurred, it would have still been a problem. But they would have been there with honesty and integrity. Yes?
So what was their purpose on approaching 2x2 the Cherokee courthouse when the trial was going on? What did they think was going to happen? What did they intend to do when they got to the door of the schoolhouse?
Okay, the question is, why did they march in pairs up to the schoolhouse? What did they think was going on in the courthouse?
What did they think they were going to do when they got there? Were they going to arrest the judge and jury?
The question is, what were they going to do, arrest the judge and jury? I think one of the problems, and this is borne out by an awful lot of research, a lot of research. The first part of the question, why did they march in pairs of two? Because they saw people running away from the building. They had to be aware that this was a very unusual circumstance. Trial hadn't been going on at the Whitmire School. It was moved that day for a single purpose. They probably didn't know what that purpose was, or they wouldn't have approached that casually. But they were marched, and this is something that's in agreement by both sides, and there's not much wiggle room in this one. They marched in pairs up to the front. Their weapons were not drawn. They were holding rifles. That's as close to an aggressive position as you're going to get from them. It wasn't aggressive. 2 different times, 2 different people yelled out, "We're United States Marshals," something to that effect. "We're here to observe. We're not here to cause a problem." And it was in that conversation that White Sut Beck put a step on the threshold and the shooting began. So that went out the door. What were they there to accomplish? That's a really good question. Again, the court being held for a small time in a really defensible structure instead of the regular courthouse where court had been in session for quite a while. Now, whether it was on a daily basis, I haven't gotten the records. I couldn't tell you that if my life depended on it, but it had been going on for quite some time with the decision to this judge is going to be the sitting judge, he's not going to be the sitting judge. That had gone on for several weeks. What they wanted to accomplish in the best of all possible worlds was if Proctor was found innocent, they were going to arrest him and bring him back to Fort Smith for trial. If he was found guilty, they were going to walk away and let the Cherokee judicial system take care of it. That's the best of all possible worlds. I don't think either one was going to happen. The research doesn't bear that out. And it was probably one of the primal mistakes was to fire on the Marshals party. I don't know that they had an alternative at that point. Given the history, they were pretty sure what was going to happen, and it wasn't going to be to their benefit. Nothing happened at that period to the Cherokee's benefit. That's kind of a roundabout way of answering your question, but that's the short of it. Anyone else? Yes? Yeah, the question is, expound on the book. The Goingsnake book, the Civil War book, the Goingsnake book. This has been probably going on 25 years on its own, acquiring documents, talking with people who have documents, people with photographs, going through court records, going through the National Archives, trying to piece this thing together. That book covers in detail with a wonderful bibliography where all of the accounts come from, where the research is, who has done what, and why these conclusions are drawn as they are. Too much to do tonight by any stretch. But the material is out there, and there's enough of it that it warrants a real serious look at this story.
Who was seeking the color in this event? But later on, he became a deputy under Mr. Parker.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the question is, Zeke Proctor was the primary defendant here, pretty clearly. But later he became a deputy marshal for Judge Parker here in Fort Smith. Proctor is a real interesting person that does not fit any of the things that have been alluded to him. For example, he was an incredibly prosperous farmer, owned numerous farms, production of crops, hay, fruits, vegetables. They had a massive operation going for the time. One of the things that's not known about him is he made frequent trips back east to Tennessee and Kentucky to buy thoroughbred racehorses, of which he raced. These are not the indicators of a killer. Proctor lived in a hard time, a very hard time. But he also was a person of great generosity, kindness. He opened his home to people who needed help. And it's back again to the relocation, the Ross Ridge issue, all of these things that just fester and fester and fester. And as we all know, it still festers. Not to the degree it did then, but it still festers. And I think Proctor, the Cherokee Nation, under the circumstances, did a remarkable job given what they have gone through. Both sides have gone through things that we should not expect mortals to go through. Yes?
I'd like to thank you for recognizing the non-headline components of history that affect the public.
Thank you.
And I'm curious, kind of running to the end of the question, maybe, I would like to hear your take on Andrew Jackson as president, his fear of our vulnerability at New Orleans and the Mississippi River as the basis for the Indian Removal Act and his defiance of the Supreme Court.
Yeah, boy, that's a long question. What do I think about Andrew Jackson as president? Having worked at the Hermitage and actually handled a lot of his personal pieces, not much. That said, if you read Jackson's history, where he was raised, how he was raised, what he went through during the Revolution, I don't know how he could have been anything but what he was. Do I agree with his policies? I absolutely do not. The John Marshall decision, that is the most appalling thing to me. I have friends that use $20 bills as target practice on fences, and I understand that. I do not understand how a sitting president takes it on himself to override the Supreme Court of the United States. Things can't work like that. They did work like that. The land grab, of which Jackson profited highly from, I don't know how we do that to other mortals. And I think that's one of the things that we have missed the boat on. These aren't demons. These aren't the enemy. These are our neighbors. These are our friends. These are our relatives. They have the same emotions, the same feelings as we do, and we have treated them horribly. for almost every indiscretion on one side, you have an equal or compatible indiscretion on the other side. It was just a terribly ugly time. And I have trouble because in the 21st century, it's really difficult, I think, for us to put our morals, our ethics on what these people lived through. Different world, different world. And I think I'm out of time, am I correct? With that, I thank you very much. Sorry to go over, but
I appreciate
some
it.
of the questions were kind of.
That's right. Hello there. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Patrick Weeks. I'm the president and CEO of the United States Marshals Museum. I want to thank you again for coming out tonight. We appreciate you being a part of the last in the spring lecture series of 2018. We appreciate you going out of your way to be a part of our lives and to be a part of our storytelling. Rick, I'd like to say thank you again for coming out and sharing your expertise on this subject. It's always great to get more in-depth insight into something as tragic as Goingsnake and to hear more about the bloodiest, biggest gunfight of the Old West. Kind of puts the OK Corral to shame, right? So with that, I'd like to say again thank you. I'd like to give you a quick update on the project. Construction starts early summer, which is wonderful for the site and facility. And the news of the day is that thanks to cost savings and fundraising efforts by the foundation team, we have crossed the $18 million mark, so we have just under $18 million left to go, which is a great bit of news. So we're on our way. It's in our sights. We're going to be celebrating 230 years next year, September, and we're looking forward to opening the museum. So that said, I want to say a big thank you to the United States Marshals Museum team, from admin staff to education, curatorial, to the foundation team, for making this happen. If you see one of them, give them a squish for me, would you? Thank you very much. Have a great night.